Hello, hello. Welcome to another town hall. Looks like we already have some friends in the chat. Welcome, Tyler, Keith, Andrew. Andrew's in Malaysia. I hope the future is well. I'm excited about today's town hall. So I have Rob and Toby with me. We're all going to be presenting. We have some exciting things to talk about. The first thing I do want to highlight, and I've been highlighting this, but it's not too late to join. We are implementing React Server components as part of our Bighorn epoch. And so if you would like to be a part of the working group and just to get the insider update, you'll get access to a Slack channel. We would love feedback as we're continuing to implement RSC and SSR and server actions and all the things. So you can use that QR code, fill out a Google form, and we will be in touch. So one of the things that we're doing right now that is pretty exciting is we are trying to migrate our docs over to Redwood. So right now they're in a DocuSource project, and we're trying to put as much of our stuff on Redwood. And there's several reasons for this, but really the main one is we are not only framework developers, but we're also actively using the framework and experiencing it just like you would. So as part of that, Rob had him walk through the docs and how we're using RSC and Markdown, more specifically MDX, so you can get those React components within your Markdown files.
All right, are we ready?
Let's do it.
Hello, everybody. Let's see, is my screen sharing?
Ooh, that's everything.
Okay.
Perfect.
Cool. All right, so you can check out this article we have on the blog here, where I'm going to talk through, well, this article basically explains everything I'm about to show you, just in case you want to come back to it. But the idea was we wanted to kind of stress test our initial RSC implementation, see how far we could get with a real app in the real world. So here's our existing doc site. It's plenty, works just fine. It's on DocuSource. If you go to our homepage, go up to docs, you come to it. And it's fine, but we thought, it'd be kind of neat that if we dog fooded our own RSC stuff and kind of rebuilt the doc site using RSC. So how far can we get with our current implementation? If we take a look at the Redwood repo itself, this is where the docs actually live. So if you at the root of the thing and you go to docs, this is sort of the DocuSource container, and then docs again. Now these are the actual Markdown docs. And we like keeping them right next to the code. Makes it really easy when you're doing a PR, you're writing the docs at the same time as you're writing the code. So what we want to do is keep these in here and get them now deployed in an RSC app. So you see here in the blog post, we have a little list of requirements that we came for ourselves. We want to keep the docs in the repo. We don't want to like move them to this new doc site repo. You keep them in Markdown or MDX. The nav structure of the docs would be nice if you could just, depending on whatever directory structure the docs themselves are in, that's how they're presented on the site. You don't have to have like a separate, DocuSource has this sidebars file where it's a big JSON file where you actually then, that's where you denote the actual nesting structure of all the docs. We didn't want to have to worry about that. The app should have real world usage of RSC. If you're really going to deploy a real doc site, you'd probably just do a static site to keep it simple and fast, but we really wanted to use actual RSC. So the docs are actually generated on the fly. We'll show you that. And then creating or modifying the docs, you shouldn't have to do anything. We call this docwood, is the code name for the app. You shouldn't have to do anything to docwood itself. If you just change the docs, they should be able to show up on the site. So modify the docs does not require redeploy. So let's see, what does it look like? So right now, this is actually deployed on fly. You can check this out. And it's fairly unstyled right now. This is just more like informationally for ourselves, can keep track of what's going where. And for anyone else who's checking out this repo, you can kind of get a neat structure of how things are actually being built. And you'll see here it kind of starts at the docs layout, which wraps everything. And the docs layout sort of introduced the first kind of problem that we had with our initial RSC implementation. Ideally, this navigation cell here would probably live in the layout because it doesn't change from page to page. This is just a list of docs. That's never changing. So I first tried out to put this in the layout, but that won't work. Our initial RSC implementation, the layouts were actually still rendered in the browser, and everything below that was rendered on the server. So I couldn't have the cell in the layout. I had to go to the page. So now in this case, the page sort of acts as the layout, and you'll see that's where these cells live. So if you look at the page here, we got the docs navigation cell, the docs renderer cell that's rendering the actual Markdown file into HTML, and then we got a little table of contents. So on the current page that you're on, you can kind of jump around through these quick links. And if we look at the navigation cell, this is the first instance you'll see here of our RSC. We call them server cells. On an original cell, you'd see query like this, and this would be GraphQL. In server cells, we have a function called data. So you just export a function called data, and anything that's returned here is made available to your success component. So this code is kind of hidden away in this code, in this function here, but it looks at the structure of the documentation and then builds this nested tree structure. And you'll notice here there's no API side. So this is all happening now in a single web server. There is, however, a docs directory. So this is there's like a sync step. So when you first build, it syncs all the docs from the repo into this directory and just sort of rearranges them in directories so they match the structure that we want. Quick start tutorial reference. We prefix them with numbers here just so they're alphabetically sorted. Otherwise, everything's just default alphabetical. So this function goes into this directory on disk, right? Remember, this is running on the server, so we can actually like access the file system and builds up this tree structure on the fly. And then it gets into the actual renderer cell. And again, this has got a data function. In this case, this data function is reading off this single file and then determining, okay, is this static markdown? Is it MDX? Or is it, we call this virtual index renderer? I'll show you that in a second. And then finally, we got the table of contents over here. So based on the page you're currently viewing, pull out all the headlines in here and turn these into like little links on the side. So again, we got data and we got our success, which renders that guy. The docs renderer cell, again, so this virtual index renderer. So some of these directories, like if we look in here into, let's say, reference and then deployment, you'll see there's no index.md, like there's no home page for deploy docs. So what we'll do is we'll generate one on the fly. So if you go here to deploy, we just on the fly, we'll look into each one of these files and these all have front matter. So we'll get the title and the description and just make a little index page on the fly. If there really is an index, like an index.md file, then we'll render that. I'm not sure if actually any of these did. I don't think we did that on the old doc site. Yeah, none of these actually have an index. So in that case, we'll be creating these on the fly. But you could, if you made yourself an index.md, then you can take over this page and design it however you want. Yeah, so I think that's it. So this is live now on docwood.fly.dev. You can check it out if you want. And I believe the repo is also here, and it should be public, so you can actually check it out and play with it if you really wanted to. I'm not sure. Is it in here?
I did share a link in the chat.
Oh, yep. Yeah, there it is.
And Andrew, sorry about the text size. I did include links though in the chat, so if you want to look at the blog post and the code and get a.
Oh, geez, is my text small? Sorry, I thought I zoomed it way up.
It's right. It's because you're showing your whole screen. All good. That's true. All good.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, check out the blog post if you want way more detail. We kind of go and break it all down. And yeah, check out the code. RSC.
Sweet. Yay for the win. Yeah, one of the things that I'm excited about is all the pieces that React Server Components just unlocks for being able to do stuff like that. So yeah. Very cool. Well, I am going to share my screen. And recently there's been a few requests within the community to implement shadcn with Redwood. And so I thought I would just walk through that process. Andrew, I'm going to try and bump up the text as much as possible. I think this is, oh, there we go. Perfect. But I was going to walk through what that looks like. So we have an open PR right now to get this implemented as a guide within our docs. And then shout out to community member Blandy, like 4 Y's on the end. But he has created, I'm assuming he, maybe she, they have created a PR on Shad's site to implement the docs on their end too. So hopefully that's coming, but we'll kind of walk through the process. So if you go over to Shad's website, I'm going to pull this up in Chrome. And if you just start on their installation page, come down to manual. So hopefully with the addition of our PR, we can get the Redwood logo on there. But if you look at the manual installation and try and follow this, you're going to run into issues. And part of the problem is because Redwood uses Yarn and we use workspaces. So you'll notice right out of the gate that they're using NPM. And the reason that we're using Yarn is so that we can have that front end and back end workspace in a mono repo. And so if you know that and try and start translating some of these commands to match Redwood, you can kind of work your way through. So the first thing is to add Tailwind CSS. So I'm going to go over to actually, let's pull up the Redwood.js website. And if you come on down, here's the create Redwood app command. So here I have an empty folder. I'm going to go ahead and run this project, and then you would normally give it the name of your project, but I'm already in the folder that I want to install Redwood in. So I'm just going to use a dot instead. Now this will go through the whole process. I'm going to use TypeScript, and we can go ahead and initialize a Git repo. That's fine. We'll use a commit message, and I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, sure, run yarn install. So this will take a minute, which is fine, because I wanted to come back over to the shad documentation. We kind of talk through some of these other things. So the first thing it says to do is to add Tailwind. Well, the cool part about Redwood is it actually provides a setup command to make this really easy. So we'll run that command in just a second. I'll share that with you. And then it says to add the dependencies. So all of these things need to go inside of our web folder so that they're going to be used on the front end, not the back end. So wherever you see npm install, you can say yarn, and then you've got to specify the workspace. So I'm going to say workspace web so that it goes in the front end. And let's see if this is perfect. This is ready. So let's go ahead and add Tailwind. So this is just yarn Redwood. We're going to hope that all the live demo stuff works. So that'll install Tailwind, which is perfect. And then we need to add those dependencies that we were looking at. So if I come back over, and I'm just going to copy all of this. Oh, it does give you a yarn command, but I bet it didn't have it's not going to have the workspace stuff. So I'm just going to copy all those packages. I'm going to say yarn workspace web so that we're putting all this stuff in the web front end section of the site. And then I'm going to paste all that in. So it'll add all those dependencies. And if we come back over, it says, okay, now add the icon library. So I'm just going to use this first option here. And I'm going to say yarn workspace, again, web, add, and paste in that icon library. And then the next part is to configure our path aliases. Now, the thing that we need to know about some of these path mappings is that Redwood uses Vite, and Vite doesn't understand TypeScript's path mappings right out of the box. So you'll need to install a plugin to help Vite understand these path mappings. So I'm going to come back over to the terminal here. I'm going to say yarn workspace web add Vite tsconfig paths. And again, this is all, I'll share a link to the PR where this is all documented. Or if you're in Discord, there's I also included a Loom video walking through all these things. So now that we have this set up, we need to go back over to our code. And actually, I don't have that up yet. So I'm going to say code period to open this particular folder in VS Code. And I'll make this bigger so it's easier to read. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to pull up, let me come back over. We want to, within our vite.config file, we need to add some things. So I'm going to go to our vite.config, and this is in the web directory. So we move this over. The first thing that I need to do is I need to import my tsconfig paths. So we'll just stick that import at the top of the page. And then under plugins, we want, we have our, let's see. We need to add, here's a list of our plugins. We want to add tsconfig paths so that we're pulling in that import that we just included. So I'm going to hit save, and I think this will resolve some of these things. Oh, I'm getting some lovely issues there. Okay, perfect. So I hit save, and it kind of reconfigured. Okay, next up, we need to go over to our tsconfig file. Let me get rid of that breakpoint. So say tsconfig, and we want to be on the website. So you'll notice there's several tsconfig files here, depending on what portion of the app that you're working in. So we want to go over to the website. And here we want to add our path aliases. So here's where these are listed out. And what this does is this means instead of having to do a bunch of relative paths, or instead of having to do an absolute URL, you can just say source, and it knows that you're going to start in the source folder of your project. So what we want to do is shad, instead of using this source slash, what it does is it has a @ to specify the source directory. So if you want to use their naming convention, so it's a straight copy paste, you can use this instead. Now, after you update your paths, in order for this to work, you might have to restart your TypeScript server within VS Code. So if I hit Command-Shift-P, you'll see there's an option there to restart the TS server. Or if you have already started Yarn Redwood Dev, your development environment within the terminal, you might need to quit that and restart it and say Yarn Redwood Dev again to get that up and running. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is we need to update our Tailwind file. So, and actually, let me come back over to Chrome just so you can see we're still following along here. Configure our tailwind.config.js file. So, when we ran our setup commands within Redwood, it created that tailwind.config.js file for us. So, what we need to do now is we need to merge this file that it provided with this file that we have here. So within the PR that I created, I have that code listed out. And the reason that you do need to be careful and not just make it a straight copy and paste is there are some things that I did have to change within this file. And I'll point them out really quick. Let me go ahead and copy this and paste this in. I'll point them out. So one of the things that is included here is if you come on down, there's some font family variables that are listed out. I just went ahead and removed those. Most of the time within your project, you'll want to specify those anyways. You can see that that's getting imported at the top. I just went ahead and left that out, but you could customize that to what you're looking for. And then if we come back over, the other thing that I did was I changed the content path. So if we come up here to the top, it's saying that you need to look inside your app folder or your components directory and watch those files. And so what Tailwind does is if it doesn't see those particular class names, it's going to drop those from your file so that you don't have any code bloat. So what I did was I modified those so that they work within our Redwood project. So you can see I'm referencing the source directory instead of an app directory. Okay, so then if we come on down, the next thing it says is to configure our styles, and it's suggesting a globals.css file. Well, within Tailwind, we don't need that. We already have a CSS file that, let's see, where are we at? It's under source. There we go, index.css. So here, what I'm going to do, and I come back over to Chrome, you can see we already have our directives up here, our Tailwind, base, components, utilities. Now we can add all of these styles here for our layers. So I'm just going to copy that and then paste that below those directives. So I'm going to give that a save. If we come back over, the next thing it says is to add a CN helper. Now what Shad does is it uses a utility called CN. It kind of creates it here. It references a library called CLSX. And all that does is that makes it easier to conditionally, you can see there, conditionally add Tailwind classes. And so you can almost use that as a function instead of having to do all these like ternary conditionals. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new file. So inside of our web source directory, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new folder here. And I'm going to call this lib for library. And inside, I'm going to create a new file called utils.ts. And we're going to add in that code that Shad provided. So we'll just copy this and paste this in. Perfect. Now, the next thing that we want to do, if we come back over to the documentation, it says, hey, that's it. So from here on, what you could do is you could copy and paste these components. So if you come over here to the code for this accordion, it's going to have you grab all of this code and paste that in. And that should work with all the paths that it provides to be able to create the accordion and the pieces that you need. Actually, if you come down to manual, it has some more information if you need to add like your Tailwind config, these imports, if there's other files that it's dependent on. But one of the things that's always nice about Shad is it does provide a command line tool out of the box. And kind of this is one of those edges that you kind of bump into because you're like, oh man, I want to use that. So I'm not just copying and pasting and revisiting the site all the time. Well, you can still use that with Redwood. That's not a problem. In order to get that to work, you do need to use, so if you use the knit command here, look at what it says. It says that it's configuring your tailwind.config file and all the CSS variables for our project. Well, we already did that. So you really don't need to do that step. But one thing that it does do is it creates a components JSON file. And what that file does is it tells you where all the pieces that you need for Shad live within your project. So what we can do is we can just manually create that file. So if I go into my web directory here, I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call it components.json. And also within that PR, which I'll link to so you can see exactly what that's doing, you have all of this code. And actually, if you go back to Shad's documentation, it is listed down, I think further down on the page where it explains what that components.json file does and all the, oh, there it goes. Here's the components.json file. And you can see he explains what each of the properties does. So if you look at the code that I provided, I've gone ahead and modified this to match up with Redwood. So really it's just a matter of making sure that your paths are set to go to your components directory here. One of the things that if you do use the command line tool, one of the things that they recommend is putting the shad components inside of a UI folder. And that's just to keep it separate so that you know that these are the shad components that came out of the box. And that just makes it easier if you ever want to upgrade based on whatever shad provides. Now, in order to run this and actually use the tool, one of the things that I recommend is if you go over to your package.json file. Excuse me. So there's several different package.json files within a Redwood project. You have the main one, then you also have one for the website and the API side. Well, if you want to stay in the root of your project, because that's really where you're running all your commands, right? You have Yarn Redwood Dev. If you're running Prisma, you're staying within the root directory. And so if otherwise, you'd have to navigate into the web folder and then run those commands because you're running all of this on the website. So what we can do is we can add a script inside of our package.json file just to make this easier. So here under, if I come down to, there's not a scripts section yet. So I can add a scripts section here. And I'm going to create a script called shad. And I'm going to say, hey, go into the web directory and then run this npx command. And what that does is that will give you the menu. If you come back over to Chrome and look inside of the CLI tool, you can see that they'll ask you what components do you want to install, and you can just go through and toggle all those. So you're basically running this command, but we have to make sure that we're running it inside the web directory. So once you add that and give that a save, you should be able to say yarn shad and then add whatever component you wanted. So you could say accordion and it would add to your project. I'm going to hit enter, but I'm I'm not sure if it will, we'll see if it'll run. But anyways, that's the process. Oh, configuration is missing. So anyways, I don't think I ran the init command. But anyways, that's the whole process for working with shad. Again, we'll have a PR up that will go into detail that includes a video walking through. Cool. So the next piece that I wanted to cover during our town hall is middleware. So this is a piece that our team has been working hard on. Shout out to Danny and DT. So I have a couple of videos that Danny recorded that I would like to share.
Hey, so I have streaming SSR set up on this project, and I'm going to show you how to register a middleware. So you go into entry server, which is the new file that gets added once you enable streaming SSR, and you export a function called register middleware. Now, this can be an async function if you wish it to, or it can be non-async as well. So this is where you register your middleware, and what you want to return from here is an array of middleware. So let's just create a couple of middleware to get started. So middle MW1, and middleware can be async functions. That takes a request, middleware request, middleware response. And let me just import these types. Let's import from here. So we have these variables, and what I'm going to do is just log the request URL and return whatever middleware response was passed to it. And let's do the same thing and create another one here. So for now, let's just add the debug middleware 1 in here, and let's see when the logs come through. And what we're also going to do is you can see the request here has all of these values that maybe we could log that. Let's say content type. Now let's start the server, yarn rw dev. Okay, there we go. That's our home page. And we can see the logs here, which means that your register middleware function is working. And if we put in debug middleware 2 here, we're going to see 2 logs, and we'll have to restart the server for the middleware to be registered again. And you can see on every request, I'm refreshing the page here, on every request, it's logging middleware 1 and middleware 2. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into how this is being stacked. So what we can do is I'm going to launch a debug terminal and set a couple of breakpoints. Something I've noticed is when you set breakpoints on console log, it might be my settings here that it doesn't break at the correct point. So I'm just going to do these here. And in the debug terminal, I'm going to launch the dev server, and we'll see what order the debug points get to. And notice here, when I registered it, I registered middleware 1 first and middleware 2 second. And you can see the breakpoint, what happened was before the request is being rendered, it hits debug middleware 1. And if I pass through here, it's going to go to debug middleware 2. And then if I pass through this one also, it's finally going to render the page. Let's take a look now at what happens when we chain these middleware and modify the responses in each. So in the first middleware, I'm going to, let's say, add a header. So let's use append x Danny header hello. We're going to add it here, and we are going to log the headers so we can see it come through. So request.headers, and we're also going to log the response.header. Let's add a cookie. Cookie.set x my cookie, and we're going to log res here. So request header, res header. And let me start the dev server again. And the request comes through. Debug middleware 1 was first, where we set both the headers and the cookie. And debug middleware 2 is where we're reading it. And we can see the request header is null, but the response header has hello, which is what we set to here. And the same for request cookie. That value is undefined. But when you get the response cookie, it's exactly what we set there. And intuitively, what's happening is the request that when you read the headers or the cookies from the request, what it's doing is whatever the header or the cookie that was sent from the browser. The response headers and the response cookies are what the server is going to send back. So in the case of chaining, you can always add extra headers or add extra cookies, but you need to be aware that you're not overwriting the same header, first of all. And second, what you need to be aware of, only when you set the cookie or the header in the response object will it be sent to the browser. Until then, it's all just in the request object, and it won't modify the response in any particular way. Let's take a couple of examples of how you can use middleware. So far, we've been looking through examples of pass-through, where if a request is coming in, I'm going to add a header or add a cookie. So let's see this in practice on the browser, and then we'll do the intercept as well. So in order to pass through, all I have to do is, let's say I'm going to set Danny was here, and we'll set the value to true. And we're returning the response we get in the middleware. So if we restart here, in the network tab, if you look in the headers, Danny was here is true. So that's an example of a pass-through middleware, adding extra things on the response, such as headers, cookies. The other type, maybe we want to intercept the request and prevent React from rendering. So to do this, I'm going to just check if the URL has the word intercept in it. I'm going to return something else or modify it. So let's set the status to 302, which is a redirect. And headers, set location to intercepted. So now refresh, nothing happens, everything is as before. But I'm just going to add a query parameter here. And of course, you need to restart the server here. And you can see it comes through as it's going into an infinite loop. And you can see it goes into this page that doesn't exist. And that's because the response had 302 and it had the header location. But what happens when I can leave the location header here? But what happens when I set some other status here? This seems to have no effect. And that's because if you want to intercept a request, you either have to set a redirect response goes, which is 301, 302, or what you need to do is, let's say 401, but we need to set the body. Once you set the body, you can see it comes back with 401 and it gives it the body. So no React rendering is happening. The last thing I want to touch on is how you can do routing with middleware. So here I have 3 middleware set up, and the same as before, I'm registering the middleware into our project. In the global middleware, I'm just logging that this is running, and I'm adding a header to say it runs on all pages. I have about page middleware as well, which logs that it's running this middleware. And finally, we have the products middleware, which does the same. But in this case, we're going to look at some more options that you get when you define the route pattern. So let's register the global middleware globally, which is the same thing as we've seen before. To register it specifically to run on about page, we have to return an array. And let's say it runs only on the about page, like this. And finally, we want to register the product page middleware, which we will run when we go to the product, and we're also going to parse the ID from there. This is useful if you wanted to get the parameters in your middleware parsed already. But I will show you another way to access this information as well. So in this case, we've set up these 3 middleware, and what should we expect to happen? This syntax, by the way, for route patterns comes from the Find My Way router, which is what Fastify uses also. You can see the syntax over on their GitHub repo or look at the Fastify docs as well. It's the equivalent syntax that we're using. So let's run the dev server. And let's first go to the home page. And we can see on the home page, only the global middleware is running. That's because we've only registered the global middleware to run on all pages. This syntax, by the way, is equivalent to returning a tuple of the middleware and star. Now let's go to the About page and see what happens. Once you get to the About page, we can see the About page middleware running. Interestingly, the global middleware isn't running in this case. We'll come back to why in a second. In the Network tab, let's look at the About page. Remember, we were adding a header. So let's find that header. Only run on About page is set to true. Great, so the middleware is definitely running. Let's now go to the product page where we said we are going to the product page and we give it some sort of ID. And here what we'll see is the product page middleware is running. And we'll see only run on product page is true. And we will see the extra details we logged, which is param, which is parsed from this route pattern that we provided. So if we change this to another name, the parameter name is going to come through as whatever name we set it to. But because a page was also mapped, as in routes page here was also mapped, we're getting all of the route details here. Now, this can sometimes be very useful depending on what you're doing with your middleware, and it's something we do in our OG generation middleware. Now let's go into why is it that I've declared star here, but the global middleware isn't running in each of these cases. And that's because how routing happens with middleware routing. When you define a star or a global middleware, it takes least precedent compared to having a static route or a parametric route. All of these rules are defined very clearly in the Find My Way docs, where they say a static takes the most precedence, then parametric regex, and at the end, we have wildcard. So what if I wanted to run the global middleware also on the product page? We can do this quite simply by adding another global middleware here, and we say also run it on the product ID. Just in case this is something you want to do, this is how you would do it. And this time, when I refresh it, you will see product page middleware followed by the global middleware. All works as a concept. We can do a deep dive into how auth is working using these middleware features. So here I have a project set up with dbauth, and it's using middleware. Again, in this project, we have streaming SSR set up. In this project, we also have the register middleware function, but instead of doing logging middleware, in this case, we're doing an auth middleware. So we import a function from Redwood.js auth dbauth middleware, and you'll have to add this package, yarn workspace web add the middleware. Something you want to be aware of is that it should have the correct version, whatever version it's matching. So you need to run it with the version that your project is on. And of course, it needs to be on Canary. Here we create the dbauth middleware, and it takes a few options. It takes cookie name. It takes the actual dbauth handler, which we have on the API side. This is so that the API side, as well as the new front-end server with middleware, works in exactly the same way. And of course, we need to give it the get current user function, and that usually sits on your API side, where you define what the shape of the current user is. Again, this is so that we have complete backwards compatibility with your GraphQL side, so that the auth on the web side works exactly the same way as the GraphQL side. Let's see this in action, and we'll run the dev server, and we'll do a breakdown of each of the requests that happen. Log in. put in my details. Once I've logged in, we can see the 3 requests that go through here. The first request goes to an endpoint called /middleware dbauth, and this is our login request. This happened when I filled in the form and put in my details. The second request happens to get the current user, and this returns whatever we had in the get current user function. And finally, we make the GraphQL call to fetch our data. And you can see the logout button here tells me that I'm logged in. Visually, let's see what this is doing when it's posting the credentials to the login endpoint. So that's this request. What we actually do is in the middleware, we are setting a cookie to set your session token. And you can see it here. It's setting the auth provider dbauth, but it's also setting the actual session cookie. This is how we know whether you're logged in or not. In the next request, we request current user from the browser. And this is reading your cookie, validating your credentials, and sending back the current user. And once this current user comes back to the browser, it updates the auth state and continues execution. Let's do a breakdown of exactly what's happening in the middleware when there's a request. I'll pull up the diagram first, and then we'll go through the code to see what's happening. So let's say we go to profile. What it's doing is it's making an HTTP request, of course, from the browser. So this is this leg here. The request will pass through the middleware. It does this validation step here. And then finally, it does a React render. And we know that it's able to validate it because it pulls through all of my details. This is all being rendered on the server. It pulls through my details, and because it has the session in the cookie. And let's look at the code to see exactly how the middleware is validating and reading the cookie. So this is the source of the dbauth middleware. And here we can see that we're returning the middleware from that create function. Over here, we have a block for if the request method is post. This is for handling the login request we saw a second ago. But we want to focus on this flow at the moment. So the first part is if you don't have a cookie, we don't need to validate the request. So let's pass through the request so that React render happens. But if you do have a cookie, what we're doing is we're calling dbauth session. This is decrypting the session from the cookie that we just added. Once you have the decrypted session, we get current user. This is calling the function you've defined in source slip auth in your API side. And finally, what we're doing is we're setting the server auth context. So validate. In this case, dbauth doesn't need to refresh the token. We decode the token, call get current user, and we set the server auth context. As part of the response in a middleware, you can also set a cookie. Let's say you're updating the cookie. You can also update that cookie. In this particular case, that only happens inside the post handlers here. Once the decryption is successful, all we're doing is we return the res. So that means effectively pass through and render the React page. If it is unsuccessful, it goes into this catch block where we set the auth context to null so that when we're rendering on the server, it's not setting my current user or my credentials. But we also call unset the cookie. So to demonstrate this, we're going to invalidate the cookie, and we'll see how the cookie gets removed when we arrive on this page. Let's have the network tab open. And what I've just done is I've tampered with the session token so that it's invalid. And now when we refresh, we get a redirect to the login page. But let's see what the response had. What we're expecting to see here is a set cookie. And you can see that when you unset a cookie, it's unsetting the session to a value of nothing, but it's actually expiring that cookie. So in your browser, if you look in cookies now, those cookies are gone. And it's also unsetting the auth provider cookie, which tells us that we need to do a DB auth decryption. Now that we've seen how
I think the video may have messed up at some point. But those will be available on, I think that was the gist of it, was getting all the auth stuff up and running. But those will be available on YouTube. Danny also has a corresponding blog post that we'll have live on our website at Redwood.js. So cool. Toby, you've been working on some awesome stuff with the router. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Going to talk a little bit about the router. And this is going to be fairly technical, and we're going to dive into the Redwood source code for a little bit. As you saw in Rob's demo, when we tried using React Server components in Redwood for the Dogwoods project, we noticed that it didn't work exactly like we wanted to with the layouts and the way they integrate with our new server cells. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're thinking about doing to solve that problem. Just gonna try to share my screen here. There you go. Is this an infinite loop now?
You're up. Yeah, you just have Inception.
Okay, let's try again. Oh, entire screen, that's better. And I want to share.
Just make sure that the font size is big.
Mm-hmm.
I gotcha. There you go.
Oh, perfect. Nice. Okay, yeah, so let's go here. When we develop for React Server components, we have this test project that we call the kitchen sink. It tries to integrate all of the RSC features that we have. And to work on the server cell feature for the layouts, I have created this server cell here that reads its own source code and prints it to the page. And looking in this kitchen sink test project, we can see this is the routes file. It looks exactly as you're used to it from your own Redwood projects. It has the navigation layout. And at the bottom here, you can see this server cell. And the server cell reads its own source code, as I said, and then prints it to the screen. So this is what we want to be able to do. The problem that we have currently is that this routes file is used both on the server and on the client. So in the first iteration of React's in Redwood's RC implementation, all of this was only the routes file was only read on the client or used by the client. So if we start looking in app, which is actually if we look at entry client, this is the root of your app. This is where React starts rendering everything on the client. So you can see root.render. This is React stuff. Takes our app component as a parameter there and render this. So we have a few contexts here and context providers. Let's try to zoom. Someone asked. Let's switch to something light. Light. hopefully that's better. So yeah, so this is the normal app that you all have in your Redwood projects. And as you can see, your routes here are wrapped by these providers. And if you dive into these, you can see that they use React contexts, and contexts are one of the things that you're not allowed to use in server-side React. So like in React Server Components, you can't use contexts. So that's why we initially decided that we wanted to render this on the client so that we can keep using all of our existing providers here. And same thing here. I don't have it set up in my example app here, but a very common use case for sets is to wrap your own custom contexts around paths, around your routes here, so that they can access, so that they all can access data in your React contexts. And we wanted to keep that functionality, so we decided to also render the routes only on the client, but then make the pages themselves render on the server as React Server components. But that also means that layouts would only render on the client and therefore could not use server components. So the initial thing that we did was to have the routes rendered on the server and on the client, so that you can have server cells on the server and then but keep all your existing context and everything on the client. And that worked for a little bit, but as you might imagine, it gets complicated when you try to render the same thing on both the client and on the server. So our latest attempt here is to only render the routes on the server. And actually, we decided to only render app on the server as well. So now we have entry server being where everything starts on the server. And we have a special, in this test project then here, a special server router. These are supposed to merge so that there's only one routes file in your project when we launch this. Anyway, so with this, we could make it render on the server, and we could get streaming SSR working together with React Server components, which is actually what I showed you here. For this to work, I had to turn, like this is pre-rendered. I'm gonna try to zoom in a bit because I'm gonna dive into the net stuff here. This is the initial response from the React, from our server with the React Server components. And you can see that the response has all of the data in it. And like this is the full page HTML. So this is great because this will give you that fast initial response with everything loaded up, so that your browser doesn't have to wait for JavaScript to download until it can render the page. This is also great for SEO, so that bots can get the initial HTML directly and include it in search results. But as I said, we only got this working for the initial load. So if I turn on JavaScript, things will break. Okay, so that's great. But now, of course, we need to make it work with JavaScript enabled as well, so that you can actually interact with the page. Because now it's just like if I click this increment button, the counter here doesn't change because no JavaScript is loaded. Going back to, oh, that's the wrong window. Going back here to our router, this one or this one doesn't matter. When we try to render this with the client, now that we have a server cell inside the navigation layout, it will it will break. It will give you an error and crash. So we can no longer use this file on the client, only on the server. So instead of having so first we had a client-only routes file, then we had a server and a client routes file. Now we're moving to just having a server-side routes file. And instead we are going to build a virtual client router. Because the client still needs a router to be able to do routing. When you click on links, like the browser needs to know what page to load next. But we can't use this file for it because it includes server-side only code. And this is where we dive into how the router actually works. So this is this looks like normal React components to anyone looking at this file. But really, the way Redwood treats this file is more like a config file. Like we read this, and then we parse the information that we need from it, but we don't actually let React render this. So if we look at the implementation for a route in the framework itself, this is the route. You can see it doesn't actually render anything. So this file looking like a React component is just fake. It's just to make it, because it's just to be able to use this nice JSX syntax that is familiar to anyone working with React. So this could be any config file format pretty much, but we wanted to keep the familiarity of JSX. So what we do instead of letting React render this is that we have this analyze routes function here. We give it the children. So this lives in the router. So the router takes all its children and just analyzes these and builds up a structure with all the information that it needs to figure out what page to render. So the idea now is to take that structure, convert it to JSON on the server, and send that structure over to the client instead, so that the client then can take the structure and build its own virtual in-memory router instead of using the routes file for it. And this, it seems to work well. And in this kitchen sink test project here, I have manually written this just to try out the concept without having to actually implement the generation of the JSON. I have manually written what I think it should look like, and this is exactly what the analyze routes function produces, with the only exception that when we use the results from this here on the server and actually do rendering, all the pages are like the actual page components themselves. But when we send it over, we just send the name of the pages and the layouts. So about page here is just a string about page, whereas on the server it's the actual about page component itself. So we pass this over as a JSON object. It's fairly large, so let me minimize that. And then we have to bring the pages back themselves. So the way that we do that is we have this render from RC server function that takes the page here, takes the name of the page, and then on the server, it renders the page as a React server component and then sends it back to the client, to the browser or to the client in this case. And this works for pages, but currently we have a problem with all of the layouts, which is the set wrappers. So looking here again, like the set, they have a wrap prop, and all of the wrappers in here are layouts in this example. So we do the same for these as we do for the pages. We just ask the RSC server to render them for us. But whenever that happens, for some reason, we end up in an infinite loop, and that's where we are stuck currently. So if any of you is interested in helping out with Redwood's RC implementation, it would be awesome if you could sign up for that RC working group that we have that Amy talked about at the start of the town hall. And yeah, perfect. That's the QR code for it. And we will, and just mention that you want to help with the virtual client router that we're building, and I will help get you started. And we can look at this together and see if we can figure out why it's doing the infinite loop here. I will also later today or tomorrow put a PR up, work in progress PR with the code as I have it right now, so that you can take a look and see if you can find anything that looks like it might be causing the infinite render or infinite loop. Yeah, that's where we are currently, and that's where we need your help right now.
Thanks, Toby.
Yeah.
Exciting things ahead. So I'll just highlight it again. I know it's just up on screen, but I just encourage you to sign up for the working group if that's something that you're interested in. I'll give you an inside scoop, but also we could use your help as we continue to implement these things. And also we will be at ReactConf next week. So I will be speaking and talking about Redwood. Rob has built a beautiful booth that we will be manning. So if you're going to be in the Vegas area or at ReactConf, I just encourage you to stop by. We would love to chat. So thanks everybody. Happy May, and we will see you in June.
Thanks everybody.